Hi, everyone. So first I have a question. How many developers is here with us today? Okay, there's actually quite, quite a lot of you. So have you ever been annoyed by a designer? Quite a lot. Well, what can I tell you? Life sucks. Okay, so we designers tend to create a lot of problems when it comes to projects. So we have all kinds of inconsistencies, impossible requests, I don't know, last-minute changes, or projects that are overcrowded with old iterations. And that leaves the developer with only option he has, and that is guessing. Guessing can lead to all sorts of problems, like unexpected quality assurance issues, unnecessary multiple feedback loops between designers and the developers, or some issues that can potentially become bigger, and they take a little bit more time. So the only answer to this is basically to conduct a proper design handoff, and I'll try to explain it to you and I'll try to explain it to you. So before we continue, I'll introduce myself. My name is Matea. I am a user experience designer. I've been doing this for 4 years now, and I started with HTML, CSS, and later on I found out that user interface and user experience design is something that I find more suitable for me. I enjoy working on bigger projects. When I first started out, I worked on smaller projects, but as I progressed, the projects got bigger and bigger, and that is something that I enjoy working with now. My interests are design methodologies and interaction design. And today we are going to talk about design handover, as if you didn't notice so far. And what exactly design handover actually means. So according to some resources on the internet, design handover is a moment when design is handed over to a developer. I would disagree that it is a moment because I think it's actually a process. It's a process of design being handed over to a developer, and that process actually starts when the developer starts involving, when designer starts involving the developer into its design process, design thinking, and stuff like that. I think it helps when you involve the developer in the earliest stages as possible, because in the end, developer can actually expect what he will get in the end, and he can actually give you some feedback, what is achievable, what is not achievable, and they can actually give you some pretty good recommendations and advices in the end. So, over the course of my career, I did quite a lot of mistakes, and I mean, mistakes are good. You learn something from them, and then you try to learn other people something. And so I will try to explain what have I done wrong that got my developers frustrated and mad. So I'll admit I was afraid of talking to a developer. I was afraid of communicating my ideas. I was afraid of getting feedback. So every time I did a design, a client approved it, and I didn't facilitate any kind of developer feedback before that. And I would just send off the design and pray to God that nobody will ask me anything, and then I thought that the developer knows how to handle all of that. He just needs to slice it up, and that's it. Unfortunately, that's not how things work, and one time, I mean a lot of times before, I was working on a project, client approved everything, and I just sent a design over to the implementation phase. And then the developers and the stakeholders realized that there's something wrong with the whole user experience. Fonts are inconsistent. Developers didn't know how to, which iteration of the component should they actually use, because there were components scattered across the whole project. And my Slack was overflowing with the messages from the developers, from the stakeholders, and I kind of felt like this. It wasn't a very, very, very good experience for me. So I realized that you, as a designer, you're actually accountable for the design you're making. And with that being said, let's say, your job is to provide the developer with all the specs, with all the moving elements, with all the fonts, with all the colors, and with all the animations, if there are any, inside the project, and to send them off to the developer. You can use tools. The tools will help you out with exporting all of the assets. But the tools itself, they're not the whole process. They are not the handoff. I also learned how to involve the developers into my design process. I learned how to ask them questions and which questions I need to ask them. So I don't complicate too much about asking questions. I just send them simple sketches or low-fidelity mock-ups, and I just go and ask, is this okay? Is this achievable? Can you take a look at this? Can you give me some feedback? Or I even ask them for some advice. Is there anything we can do about this to make it a little bit better? I learned how to include user flows. User flows are, in my opinion, are important to provide the developer with, because then the developer doesn't need to ask you a bunch of questions. What button does this do? Where is this link leading me? And stuff like that. In my projects, I like to use style guides. I like to use them because in one place I have all the fonts, all the colors, and all of the components. I don't integrate all of the components. They can be as simple as some inputs or some buttons. So nothing too spectacular, but I think in the style guide there should be components that are being used across the whole design. And of course, I cannot stress enough, you need to have consistent colors and consistent fonts, because in the end, that leads to a lot of confusion. Animations, if the project requires animations, then of course you should do them also and hand them over to the developer. There are some great tools to help you with that. We will cover them later. And of course, ask questions, as I mentioned before, because the developer is here to help you out, and we designers are here to help the developer out. As much as we think that we're different, we're actually in the same space, and we just need to how to collaborate and communicate together. So tools, as I mentioned before, tools only help you out in your handoff process. So when I export designs with using some of the handoff tools out there, it's not just, okay, I'm sending it over to the developer and that's it. You don't do that. So the tools serve us three purposes. The first one is for the designer to export the design. Second one is for the developers to inspect and implement said design. And the third one is to facilitate some kind of communication and collaboration between the two of them. So these are some tools that I use for my export, for my handover process. So I like to use Sketch for user interface design. Slowly but surely, I'm transferring to Figma because I find it more useful. It's basically the first 3 apps that I placed here combined. The thing I really like about Sketch is their usage of symbols, because symbols, at least I have really great experience with working with symbols in Sketch. Sketch is a bit pricey, so that's not a plus. And it's great for creating user flows. But lately, for user flows, I've been using XD, so we'll come to that. I also find Sketch pretty cool when you have a developer that works with you in one office, because I usually just send the developer a Sketch file, and then he can basically slice and export the assets he actually needs, and we can sit together and talk about the project. I used Avocode before, and I used it when I worked with a remote team and a team that didn't have a MacBook computer, because Sketch is only available for MacBooks. So I did all of the export in this case, and it was a lot easier for me. Also with Avocode, your design file needs to be very tidy. So it doesn't read very well if you have a salad of layers and inside one project. XD, I don't prefer it for a user interface design tool because it lacks some tools that I really find useful in Sketch. But I find it extremely useful and user-friendly when it comes to user flows. Prototyping is very fast with it, and it can grow on you pretty fast. Principle, I use Principle for animations. I know there is also Flinto, but I find Principle more user-friendly, and its user interface is similar to Sketch, so it's easier to use it together with Sketch. The only setback here is that when you export animations with Principle, you have to actually communicate. You need to explain the animation to the developer. So you need to have like some sort of collaboration with the developer, because it doesn't export all of the technicalities of the animation. It just exports the end visual file. So the developer only gets the idea how it would look like. So when we talk about tools, in my opinion, as we said, to sum up, tools are here to help you out. They can facilitate communication, collaboration, and it's really important to involve your developers into your process. What I like to do is, before each project, I just sit with the developer and tell him a bit about the project. I introduce him to the domain, I explain to him what the client actually wants, and then I like to sketch with him sometimes. It's not something that you should do like every time, but it helps me to convey my ideas to the developer. Lean UX methodology has a similar stuff when you just sit with the developer, with all the team members, and then you just reiterate on your process and get immediate feedback. So I try to do something similar to that. Using style guides, I find it very useful, and it's cool if you have some time. So you don't need to create style guides like every time. A new style guide for every project, you just create one template file and just import it into your designs later on, where you define the consistency, the consistent stuff that you want to use across your project. And in the end, I'd like to emphasize, don't be lazy, because sometimes designers can be a bit lazy when it comes to projects, and then they're like, yeah, the developer knows exactly what I'm thinking. I don't need to design. I don't need to account for empty states or long labels or anything like that, because the developer will know how to handle that. Well, we designers should handle that before sending it off to the developer. And I think that is connected a bit to laziness, because you just can't wait to design it and just send it off and continue with the next project. At least that was sometimes in my case. But yeah, it's also a bit tricky when you have really short deadlines. So it's not laziness, you just don't have enough time. A lot of times happen that I worked on a project, I sent it off to the developer, and the next day I already had another project that I had to work on, and that created like a big confusion, because I needed to fix stuff from leftovers from my old project, and then I just received like a new project that I needed to really focus on. So yeah, laziness is a really relative term here. And yeah, that would be it for me. You can find me here on my web or my Twitter or at the bar later. And yeah, roast me.
Congratulations. This was your first conference talk.
Yes.
Congratulations. Does anyone have any questions about design handover?
Don't worry. So one question, at what part of the design stage do you include the developer? Beginning, middle, or do you constantly do back and forth with the developers?
Well, it depends on the project. Like if the project is, we have a really tight deadline on a project, then I usually just do it at the end. But if we have some free time, then, if we have more time, then I like to involve the developer at the beginning, especially in the middle, and then at the end.
Because I want to touch on that, because usually when you get involved at the end, from the developer perspective, we have so much changes, and that leads to much more time needed to change, because, for example, we need to change the whole flow. That makes it complicated for you and for us, so that's why I'm asking. Yeah. Thank you, and great talk.
Thanks.
Hello, nice talk. I was just wondering if you believe that designers should at least have some basic knowledge of the technologies they're designing for. And do you think that could make the handover easier or make the entire development process faster?
Yeah, I totally agree, because when a designer has some background on the technicalities, on the technologies that the developer is using, then he can pre-handedly account for some potential issues that could come up in the implementation phase. And at least in my experience, when the designer who doesn't have as much experience with some technologies starts to design something, there's usually more and more problems later on in the implementation phase. So yeah, I think it's important to have some background on technical stuff.
Thank you.
So this is coming from a very painful place at my work. We have a designer who is very talented, but will often submit designs to us as engineers, and they're always missing the same three things. Number one is, what does it look like when it's loading? What does it look like when there's an error? And what does it look like when there's 2 million results as opposed to the perfect 5? And so my question is twofold. Number one, do you as a designer have a checklist like this that you use? And number two, what are some practical ways I can help our designers kind of think about these things all the time?
Been there, done that. Yeah, I had that kind of problem, so especially in the beginning. But I learned to, my solution would be to create, as I mentioned, like a style guide. A style guide that would convey all of those stuff you're eventually finding missing each and every time. But the designer will have to assemble that for himself. You can just hand him over a checklist, what needs to be included into every project, and then just ask politely, nicely, please, can you account for this stuff on every project? So that could be a potential solution. But style guide is the key to this problem, because in the same place he can have fonts, colors, components, and those screens. So yeah.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions. So one more applause for Matea.
Thank you.